Hi guys, and welcome to this new episode of The Inexplicable. Today I'll take you to a forgotten corner of Europe, among the spectral woods and lost villages of Istria. Along that coast washed by the Adriatic, which once teemed with superstitions, archaic rituals, and fear. Yes, because what I'm about to tell you is not a fairy tale, it's not a story invented to scare children. It's a story found in official documents, recorded in history, and written by those who truly lived it. Or at least that's what they say, the story of Yure Grando, the first documented vampire of whom there is still a trace. A corpse that refused to remain in its grave. A being who, according to the chronicles, returned among the living at night, knocked on the doors of the village houses, and spread terror among the inhabitants. Ready to feel a chill down your spine? So here is the true story of Yure Grando, the first documented vampire. To truly understand the legend of Yure Grando, we need to take a journey back in time. Imagine 17th-century Istria, a rugged and fascinating peninsula stretching into the Adriatic, between what is now Croatia, Slovenia, and Italy. At that time, this region was a patchwork of rural villages, dense forests, and small farming communities. Life was hard, marked by the seasons and the need to survive. Wars, famines, and epidemics were not rare events, and death was a constant, tangible presence. Amid this harsh daily life, there was also a rich world of beliefs, legends, and superstitions. Istria in the 17th century was deeply religious, but Christianity often conflicted with ancient pagan cults and folk magic. Anything inexplicable, any misfortune or illness, any sudden death could be attributed to dark forces. In this cultural climate, the vampire figure found fertile ground. Long before Bram Stoker wrote Dracula, the belief in vampires was already deeply rooted throughout Eastern Europe in Serbia, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and indeed in Croatia. Stories circulated about undead creatures that fed on the blood of the living or haunted their loved ones after death. These entities had different names: Upir, Vrikolakas, Strigoi, but everywhere their role was the same: to bring ruin and terror. They weren't charming, aristocratic, wearing black cloaks like modern imagination suggests. They were horrible beings, often ordinary peasants who after death returned to haunt the villages. Rural communities firmly believed these threats. Vampire stories weren't fairy tales, they were considered real chronicles, so much so that religious and civil authorities would officially intervene in suspicious cases. In many areas, it was an accepted practice to exhume corpses to check for any signs of vampirism. Apparently intact bodies, fresh blood in the mouth, grown nails, and hair. And it is in this world steeped in fear and superstition that the story of Yure Grando takes place, a simple farmer from the small village of Kringa in Istria, whose death, or supposed undeath, would go down in history. But who really was this character, and what happened in that remote Istrian village? Let's find out together. Between legend and reality. The story of Yure Grando has its roots in a small village on the Istrian peninsula, Kringa, in present-day Croatia. We are in the 17th century, a time when superstitions, legends, and ancestral fears were an integral part of everyday life. Yure was, as far as we know, an ordinary man. Not a nobleman, priest, or scholar. He was a simple laborer who shared with the other villagers a life made up of hard work, religious rituals, and a deep respect, or perhaps fear, for everything that escaped rational understanding. He was married and led a modest, seemingly quiet life. In short, nothing suggested that his name would one day become legendary. But during his life, it seems on several occasions in the village, he had made people talk about him. No one knows why, but among the inhabitants of Kringa, there were those who considered him odd. He had a peculiar attitude towards his neighbors, perhaps too reserved or, on the contrary, excessively outgoing. The fact is that several people suspected him of practicing magic arts, rituals that would have gradually distanced him from the local community and turned him into an outsider. Everything changed in 1656 when Yure Grando died. There are no records documenting the cause of his death. It is presumed that he fell victim to some illness, perhaps even tuberculosis. The fact is that he was buried, according to the Christian rite, in the local cemetery. And here the story could have ended. But it was right after his burial that events began to take a rather unsettling turn. Testimonies from the time say Yure's tomb was not silent for long. In fact, the first signs that something was wrong came just a few weeks after his funeral. The local residents began to claim that they could hear strange noises in the middle of the night, noises they had never heard before. Knocks of unknown origin at the entrance doors, inexplicable creaks on the roofs of the houses, often accompanied by muffled wails of supernatural origin. There was no reason that could justify those phenomena. It didn't take long for word to spread that the village had fallen under the influence of a terrible curse. But, at least at first, it wasn't linked to the disappearance of Yure. Until the apparitions began. Some residents reported seeing Yure Grando wandering among the houses, dressed in the same clothes he was buried in, pale as the moon and with a monstrous grin on his face. From what they said, the figure was devoid of any humanity, resembling that of an evil creature wandering aimlessly through the village streets. And soon, the stories began to speak of terrible consequences suffered by those who had the misfortune of being visited by Yure. Some reported hearing him knock 3 times on the door of certain villagers' homes, and that the next day someone in that house would die inexplicably. As time went by, these accounts became more and more numerous. Rumors spread like a disease. Yure has never died. He has become a strigoi, and everyone in the village was overcome with panic. But what does strigoi mean? In the Istrian tradition, a mix of Slavic, Roman, and Venetian influences, it was a creature of the night, a sort of sorcerer or vampire, able to rise from the grave, feed on the life energy of the living, and bring disease, misfortune, and death. Different from the literary vampires born in Romanticism, the strigoi, also called strigan, was part of a deeply rooted, concrete, and lived popular belief. It was perceived as a real threat. Over the years, the accounts grew even more sinister. Some said Yure would sneak into homes and sit on women's chests, suffocating them, a behavior that inevitably relates to succubi, demonic beings known for feeding on their victims' life energy in exactly that way. Others claimed to have seen him running through the fields, shouting and laughing, while dogs chased after him or hid, letting out desperate howls caused by terror. Be careful, as even Yure's widow helped spread rumors about him. Instead of trying to deny the rumors, she confirmed what the villagers had reported. One day, she supposedly went to the neighbor's house in tears to make a confession. "My husband Yure comes back from the grave every night to torment me. He stands by my bed, silently laughing and staring at me with empty eyes. I can't sleep or find peace." At that point, the village fell into absolute panic. No one dared to go out after sunset for fear of encountering the living dead. The doors were barricaded with wooden planks, the windows sealed with crosses, garlic, and sacred symbols. Families gathered to pray, hoping that the curse would disappear, but it would take much more than a few prayers to defeat it. The more the stories piled up, the greater the fear grew. A collective, visceral fear that crept everywhere, in homes, in the fields, even in the church. For many, if not all, it was no longer merely superstition. There really was something, or someone haunting Kringa, and it was necessary to take action to get rid of it. But what exactly could be done? With this question hanging in the air, a full 16 years went by. 16 long years, during which the shadow of Yure hung over the village. And when terror reaches its peak, people arm themselves with courage and are driven by desperation to make decisions that are, to say the least, drastic, or better yet, terrifying. The solution. In the winter of 1672, the community of Kringa decided to take action to solve the problem once and for all. Grando's nightly visits seemed to intensify, and more farmers swore they had seen him wandering the frost-covered streets, his face pale and his eyes bloodshot. It was then that the local priest, Don Giorgio, a man of great faith but even greater courage, came up with a plan. No more words, no more protective rituals. It was time to confront evil at its root. To be more precise, at the tomb, he gathered a group of 9 men, the strongest and bravest in the village. Included were woodcutters, blacksmiths, and farmers. Men toughened by hard work, accustomed to facing death. Armed with crosses, wooden stakes, and rudimentary weapons, the 9, led by Don Giorgio, set out toward the old cemetery shrouded in fog. At Yure Grandos's tomb, the priest reportedly began reciting exorcisms and praying aloud. Each word echoed in the cold night, as if challenging the darkness. But still, the efforts had no effect. The oppressive feeling, that unnatural chill, persisted. It was clear that prayers alone would not be enough. It was then that the group made a drastic decision to open the tomb and catch the undead by surprise. With trembling but determined hands, they began to remove the stone slab that sealed the tomb. The silence was absolute. Only the sound of metal and stone broke the air. When the coffin lid was lifted, the group was seized by horror. Grando's body lay there, seemingly intact. His face was flushed, lips swollen as if blood still flowed, and a fixed smile remained. A sneer that seemed to challenge those present. There was no sign of decomposition on his body, no trace of the time that had passed. According to accounts passed down through the chronicles, faced with that scene, some of the men fled in a panic. But more determined, the priest himself stayed there, determined to put an end to that torment. At that point, there weren't many alternatives left, except to take an extreme action. One of them, probably the blacksmith, grabbed a sharp axe, exchanging one last knowing glance with those present. The blade was brought down forcefully on the corpse's neck, but the decapitation was not easy. At the first blow, they say, the body let out a chilling moan. At the second, the head was severed, and with it, apparently, the nightly apparitions also ceased. With this extreme act, the curse of Kringa came to an end. From then on, the village returned to its normal life. But the memory of that event and the being who defied death stayed in the chronicles and hearts of the inhabitants. The first documented vampire in history had finally been defeated, but he would certainly never be forgotten. Among the yellow cities. You're probably wondering how and why the story of the Yure Grandos has survived through the centuries. How did it manage to reach us? To answer that, we must step back to 1689. In that year, a nobleman and scholar from Cherniol named Johann Becar von Valvassor published a monumental work, Die Ehre des Herzogtums Krim, or The Glory of the Duchy of Carniola, a comprehensive collection of stories, traditions, geography, and culture from the region, now known as Slovenia, which once included Istria. In this 3,000-page volume, alongside local customs and history, Valvassor also described this gruesome episode, or all Grandos' story exactly. But the way he did it is nothing short of surprising. Valvassor, in fact, didn't write the story as just any folk legend On the contrary, he documented it as a real event, relying on direct testimonies from local people. The author himself stated that he had faithfully and completely objectively recounted the stories of those who had witnessed the events or had been involved in them. Moreover, the scholar was erudite, a very attentive observer who would hardly have embellished with fantastic tales an event he considered to have really happened. However, we must remember he wrote at a time when history, news, and folklore were less clearly separated than today. Supernatural phenomena were often accepted as possible, if not probable, and the cultural context of 17th century Istria, steeped in superstitions, ancestral fears, and beliefs in vampires, or rather in strigoi, encouraged the birth and persistence of such stories. Furthermore, we must remember that Balbassor was not a direct witness. He collected the story several decades after the alleged events and put it down on paper, more as an oral chronicle than as a verified account. A legend was already being passed down, even though it remained vivid in collective memory. Nevertheless, this work is exactly why Yure Grando's story wasn't lost. The story has survived through the centuries, taken up by historical writers of folklore and mystery enthusiasts, fueling the myth of the vampire long before Count Dracula came from the pen of Bram Stoker. Today, Yure Grando's story endures in historical research, occult books, documentaries, and Istrian folk tales, where the figure of this ancestral vampire has never ceased to exert a dark fascination. But there's one thing I absolutely have to emphasize. Balbassor's account is the very first written record ever about the phenomenon of vampires, which concerns a real person described as a vampire, precisely. Moreover, this text was taken up the following year by Erasmus Francesi, and in 1855 by Johann Joseph von Guris, author of the work The Divine Natural Mystique of Abelic. However, he added some imaginative details about his wife Ivana, about the vampire crying at the sight of a crucifix, or about the difficulties in driving a wooden stake through his heart to destroy him. According to tradition, at this point the question arises spontaneously: what is really behind the story of Yure Grando? Was he truly a vampire returned from the grave to haunt the living? Or are there more logical explanations, able to dissolve the aura of mystery that still surrounds this ancient tale today? It's time to let science speak. Even here, as with the last vampire of America, people were struck by reports that Yure Grando's body stayed intact for 16 years after burial. When the villagers dug up the coffin, they found his corpse apparently uncorrupted, with a sinister grin on his face. What might cause this phenomenon? As mentioned on other occasions, forensic experts suggest that the preservation of the body could be explained by particular environmental conditions. The karst area of Istria is known for its limestone-rich soil and its natural caves, which can create a dry, oxygen-poor microclimate. These factors, combined with burial in a sealed coffin, could have greatly slowed down the decomposition process. Furthermore, at that time, knowledge about death and bodily decay was very limited. A naturally mummified body could easily be mistaken as a sign of not being dead. However, this natural phenomenon doesn't explain why Kringa believed Yure Grando had returned from the afterlife to haunt them. Historians point out that we are dealing with a classic case of mass hysteria. The community was small, isolated, and deeply superstitious. It took very little to spark panic. After Yure's death, the village reportedly faced a series of misfortunes. Diseases, sudden deaths, poor harvests. Lacking rational explanations, the villagers sought a scapegoat. Who better than someone already suspected of ties to dark forces in life? The suggestion took hold, fueled by rumors, frightening tales, and protective rituals. Each nighttime noise and fleeting shadow was blamed on the vampire. It didn't take long before the entire village became convinced that Yure Grando was walking among them again. But it doesn't end there. In this climate of fear, religion played a fundamental role. As I mentioned, 17th century Europe was overtaken by religious fervor that frequently mixed with superstition. It was as if the people of that time couldn't distinguish the fine line that separated popular belief from faith. That's why the parish priest of Kringa decided to personally take part in the exhumation of Jure's body and the exorcism of his grave. His presence only legitimized the beliefs about that poor peasant. The Catholic Church at the time acknowledged evil forces and promoted purification rites to oppose them. Additionally, the vampire figure fit well into the Christian narrative of sin and eternal damnation, an evil man who found no peace in death. He was a living warning against earthly temptations. The legacy of the legend. The figure of Yure Grando, this enigmatic Istrian peasant from the 17th century, has never been confined to a dark chapter of local history. His legend has crossed the centuries, leaving a deep mark both on the folklore of the region and on popular culture worldwide. First of all, the story of this dark character has become a source of inspiration for literature and folk tales, especially in Croatia and the surrounding regions. Writers and storytellers have used his myth to explore themes like ancestral fear, death, and superstition, making him the prototype of the Balkan vampire. The brutality of his appearances, his resistance to death, and the terror he inspired among the people of Kringa fueled stories passed down orally, which today are an integral part of Istrian cultural heritage. But we're not just talking about stories. Today, the legend of Yure Grando has become a real driving force for local tourism. Kringa, the small village where it all began, attracts visitors from all over the world who are curious to discover the place where it all started. Themed tours, dedicated museums, and vampire folklore festivals have become regular events that blend history with myth, turning mystery into a cultural and economic resource. Walking Kringa's streets feels like breathing in air that blends reality with legend and the past with the present. Yure Grando is more than just a historical figure or an Istrian legend. He is the primordial symbol of a myth that continues to live and evolve, crossing borders and generations, embodying our eternal fascination with the unknown and the inexplicable. But what do you think about this story? Is it possible that the figure of the vampire is not just a product of imagination, but also of real inexplicable phenomena that, although science tends to discredit them, may have contributed to the creation of this myth? What was Yure Grando really? A bloodthirsty vampire, a corpse preserved in an unusual way, or simply the result of fear? Let me know in a comment. The Unexplainable is an original format, written and directed by Luca Parella, sound design by Matteo D'Alessandro. If you enjoyed this episode, leave a like, subscribe to the channel on YouTube, or share it with your friends. Greetings, and see you at the next appointment with the Unexplainable.